December 16, 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes Forest, and Private Tommy Henderson was absolutely, completely, hopelessly lost. The snow fell in thick curtains through the bare trees, his compass needles spun uselessly because shrapnel had cracked the glass during the firefight 2 hours ago, and his map was soaked through with mud and blood, the ink bleeding into unreadable smears. He'd been separated from his Sherman tank platoon during a German ambush, took a wrong turn trying to flank around a burning half-track, and now he was alone in 30 tons of steel driving deeper into enemy territory with no idea which direction led to safety. His hands shook on the controls. Every shadow between the trees looked like a Panzer. Every crack of a branch sounded like a rifle shot. Henderson had been driving tanks for exactly 8 months, trained at Fort Knox where the biggest challenge was backing into formation without hitting anything, and his instructors had called him adequate, which was Army speak for barely acceptable. Navigation wasn't his strong suit even with a working compass and a clean map. Now he had neither, just instinct and hope and the growing certainty that he was going to die in these woods without ever firing another shot. His gunner, Roberts, kept asking through the intercom which way they were headed, and Henderson kept lying, saying he knew exactly where they were going, because admitting you're lost behind enemy lines is a good way to watch your crew panic. The engine rumbled underneath him. 37 tons of American steel pushing through snow and underbrush, branches scraping against the turret, and absolutely no clue if the next clearing would bring them to friendly lines or a German roadblock. If stories like this get your heart racing, hit that subscribe button because WW2 Vault dives into the most insane combat moments every single week. And trust me, what happens next is going to blow your mind. What Henderson didn't know, couldn't possibly know as he steered his Sherman through the frozen forest, was that about 400 yards ahead, concealed in a dense tree line with camouflage netting and carefully positioned for maximum surprise, sat 42 German Panzer tanks preparing to launch a devastating attack on American positions. These weren't just any tanks either, they were Panthers and Tigers, the most feared armor in the German arsenal, their long 75mm and 88mm guns capable of punching through a Sherman's frontal armor from 1,000 yards away. The German commanders had spent 3 days positioning this force, using the forest for concealment, planning their assault down to the minute, and in approximately 7 minutes they were supposed to break from cover and hit the American lines in a coordinated strike that intelligence officers estimated would punch a 6-mile hole in Allied defenses. 42 tanks against an American position that had maybe 15 Shermans spread across 2 miles. It wasn't going to be a battle, it was going to be a massacre, and the Germans knew it. Henderson drove for another 20 minutes. Going slower now because the trees were getting thicker and visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet in the snow. He was considering just stopping, hiding the tank, and waiting for dark when he saw a gap in the trees ahead, a clearing or maybe a logging road, somewhere he could get his bearings. He pushed forward, the Sherman's tracks churning through 8 inches of snow, and emerged from the forest into what looked like a shallow valley. Then he saw them. 42 German tanks sitting in perfect attack formation, their guns pointed away from him toward where the American lines must be, camouflage netting draped over their hulls, crews standing around smoking cigarettes and checking equipment. Henderson's brain couldn't process it at first because it was impossible, there was no way there could be this many enemy tanks just sitting here undetected, but his gunner Robert saw them too and started screaming into the intercom that they'd driven straight into a German tank battalion. The Germans spotted Henderson's Sherman at almost the same moment. A Panther commander, his binoculars focused on the American lines ahead, turned around for some reason, maybe heard the engine noise or just had bad luck timing, and saw an American Sherman tank sitting 200 yards behind their formation, in the exact direction no Allied tank should possibly be coming from. His reaction wasn't tactical or calculated, it was pure shock, because their intelligence had confirmed no American forces within 3 miles of their rear position, yet here was a Sherman pointing directly at the most vulnerable part of every tank in the formation. Rear armor on a Panther was only 40mm thick compared to 80mm in front, and a Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate that from this range without even trying. The German commander started shouting into his radio, trying to warn the other tanks, trying to figure out how an entire American force had gotten behind them without anyone noticing. Henderson had about 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine if he lived or died, if his crew survived the next 5 minutes, if the American lines 3 miles away got overrun or held. He could reverse back into the forest, try to disappear before the Germans organized a response, and maybe, if he was incredibly lucky, escape and warn someone about this massive tank formation. Or he could do something so insane that his training instructors would have failed him on the spot. Roberts made the decision for him by loading a high-explosive round into the main gun and screaming that they needed to shoot now, right now, before every German gun turned around and blew them into pieces. Henderson's hand found the trigger almost on instinct, and the Sherman's 75mm gun roared, the entire tank rocking backward from the recoil. The first shell hit a Panther directly in the rear engine compartment, right where the fuel tanks connected to the transmission, and the German tank exploded in a fireball that sent its turret spinning 15 feet into the air. Henderson's loader, a kid from Detroit named Martinez, already had another round chambered, and Roberts fired again, this time hitting a Tiger Eye that had started to turn around, the shell punching through the thin rear armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. 2 German tanks burning in 10 seconds. The other 40 commanders were now completely panicked because what they were seeing didn't match any tactical scenario they'd trained for, and the only explanation their brains could process was that they were being flanked by a much larger American force that had somehow circled behind them through terrain their intelligence had marked as impassable. The German radio net exploded with overlapping transmissions, commanders shouting that they were surrounded, that American tanks were attacking from the rear, that they needed to abort the attack and defend their position, and in the chaos nobody stopped to count that it was actually just one Sherman firing as fast as its crew could load. Henderson kept shooting, kept moving, backing up slightly and shifting positions so the muzzle flash came from different angles, anything to create the illusion that he had support, that he wasn't alone. A Panther finally got its turret turned around and fired, the 75mm shell screaming past Henderson's tank and slamming into a tree 50 yards behind him, but Martinez already had another round ready and Roberts put it directly into the Panther's side armor at the joint where the turret met the hull, the weakest point, and the German tank started burning. The German formation was falling apart now because their advantage had always been surprise, careful positioning, and overwhelming firepower concentrated on an unaware enemy. But all 3 of those factors had vanished the moment Henderson appeared behind them. Tank commanders were screaming contradictory orders, some wanting to complete the original attack, others demanding they turn and eliminate the American force in their rear, and several were already backing their tanks deeper into the forest because they assumed if the Americans had gotten behind them, they must have superior numbers and better intelligence. Henderson fired 7 rounds in 90 seconds, destroying or disabling 5 German tanks, and creating enough chaos that the entire German attack plan disintegrated into confusion and panic. A Tiger Eye commander, more experienced than the others and trying to restore order, finally got a clear look at Henderson's position and realized it was a single tank, just one Sherman with a crew that had either lost their minds or found them, but by then it was too late. 3 other German tanks had already started retreating, their commanders convinced they were being surrounded, and once a few tanks started moving backward, the panic spread like fire through formation. The German officer in charge of the entire operation, sitting in a command Panther 300 yards away, made the decision to abort. He radioed all units to pull back, regroup 2 miles north, and reassess the situation, because continuing an attack when your rear position was compromised was tactical suicide. 42 German tanks, the tip of what should have been a devastating breakthrough, started backing into the forest and disappearing. Henderson didn't chase them because he wasn't stupid enough to push his luck that far, and his crew was yelling at him to get out of there before the Germans realized what had actually happened. He reversed the Sherman back into the trees, drove west for about 2 miles, and finally found an American supply convoy that nearly shot him before recognizing the tank markings. The convoy radioed ahead to headquarters, and Henderson's Sherman rolled into friendly lines 40 minutes later with an empty ammunition rack and a crew that couldn't stop shaking. When Henderson tried to explain what happened, the intelligence officer didn't believe him at first, thought maybe he'd gotten turned around and seen the same 5 German tanks from different angles, but a reconnaissance plane confirmed it 3 hours later. 42 German tanks had been in position for a major attack, and something had caused them to abort and retreat. The attack that should have punched through American lines and potentially changed the entire Battle of the Bulge never happened because one lost tank driver accidentally showed up in the exact place no German commander expected, and did exactly what he had to do even though the odds said he'd be dead in seconds. The thing is, Henderson never meant to be a hero, never intended to save hundreds of American lives or disrupt a major German offensive. He was just lost, scared, and trying to survive, but sometimes in war the difference between disaster and victory comes down to pure accident, to being in the wrong place at exactly the right time. Tank warfare is about angles and armor thickness and who sees who first, and Henderson had accidentally achieved what Allied commanders spent weeks planning, a perfect flanking position against enemy armor with nowhere to hide and no time to react. The Germans had trained for frontal assaults, prepared for defensive battles, studied every tactical scenario except the one where a single lost Sherman would appear behind them through terrain they'd marked as impassable, and that blind spot cost them an offensive operation that had taken weeks to organize. Henderson got a Bronze Star for his actions that day, though he always maintained he didn't deserve it because getting lost isn't exactly medal-worthy behavior, and he'd only opened fire because Roberts kept screaming at him and his hands found the trigger almost by accident. But the military historians who studied the engagement later saw something different, saw a moment where individual initiative and desperate courage disrupted an enemy offensive that could have killed thousands. The American positions Henderson accidentally saved didn't even know they were in danger until after the German attack fell apart, didn't realize that 42 enemy tanks had been pointing at them until reconnaissance confirmed the abandoned attack positions. Sometimes you save lives without ever knowing you're doing it. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Forest had become a graveyard for German armor, with hundreds of panzers destroyed or abandoned, but Henderson's accidental engagement stood out because it showed how vulnerable even the most powerful tanks became when their tactical assumptions broke down. German armor doctrine relied on careful planning, superior positioning, and overwhelming force applied at the enemy's weakest points, but all of that collapsed when the unexpected happened, when one lost American tank appeared where it shouldn't exist and started shooting at the place German engineers had made thinnest to save weight. Rear armor has always been the Achilles heel of tank design because you can't make every surface thick without the tank becoming too heavy to move, so designers gamble that the rear will stay protected by tactical positioning. Henderson's accident broke that gamble. Thanks for watching this story about how one lost tank driver accidentally stopped a German offensive. Hit subscribe to our channel for more incredible combat stories every week, because next time we're covering the moment American bomber crews discovered they could survive attacks that should have torn their planes apart. You won't want to miss it.